to stay here over a massage. Much appreciated. Okay. Sorry, I know this is kind of old, but I'm curious to know how much of you have read a lot about jobs to be done. How many of you have? Sorry. Okay, fair number. Keep your hands up if you are using it right now. So a few, yeah, if you're, well, not right now, but have done and are sort of, in the progress of less. Okay, it's a little dark, but I can see you. All right, okay, good stuff. Thanks very much. So I'm going to help us with some language and maybe just a lens to understand the landscape, because jobs to be done is a rather complicated landscape out there if you started reading any of the articles. So hopefully by the end of the session, you will have a better idea of how things fit together, yeah? Maybe just to illustrate, I thought that after lunch it's probably appropriate to talk about coffee. This is a coffee maker that my husband brought back about 2 years ago. Well, not this exact one, but one just like it. And it came with something like this. If you know your coffee terminology, it's got a group, the little basket metal bit in the middle where the coffee goes into. And it also comes with a milk frother, which we've never used, and a little weird spoon called it's like a tamper and a spoon at the same time. So the idea is you scoop the coffee into the group and you sort of tamp it with it and to make it flat. It's a pretty thing, but what happened was we had a grinder like this. I love this grinder. I use it every day, twice a day, because I just want to press the button, go away, start the hot water, and get my coffee ready. Previously, we've used this for something like this, which is a double-wall vacuum sort of steel business by Bowden, which I bought because my husband broke the glass one that we had. So I figured if I buy one that will never break, we'll never have a problem again. We use it for the AeroPress, if you're a coffee nerd. This is one of the best, most interesting coffee making sorry, I bet you weren't thinking that you're going to get a lesson in coffee making, but trust me, we're getting somewhere. So there's this whole notion where, so the AeroPress is an interesting thing because you can actually control the, how long you want to brew it for. So, you can change the shape of the coffee that you make. I love my grinder. But the grinder doesn't work for this thing because this is an espresso maker and you need a really, really fine grind for espresso. So what we ended up doing was we ended up getting one of these, which was a lovely, beautiful piece of kit, which is a hand grinder. I mean, I don't like it. Don't tell my husband that. It takes up a lot of space on the counter, and it's made for right-handers. Anyway, so the moment we got that, though, we realized that little tamper spoon that came with the thing doesn't work very well anymore. So we bought a tamper, a proper metal one. Then you realize that actually you've got to tamp it onto the counter, and it's sort of, I don't want to damage that counter if we want to sell the flat one day. So we bought one of these things, which is a little silicone thing, and you do, okay. And then you eventually we had to use a knockbox because the moment the coffee comes out of the coffee maker, it's too hot to put in the bin. Yes, this is an ongoing discussion in my household, if you haven't realized already. We, random fact about me that most people don't know, I actually have a barista cert, which I've never used, so I've never worked behind it. But I've always had a dream that I want, so I thought like the epitome of coffee making is if I can make the perfect espresso with a manual machine. This thing costs like £2,000, £3,000 maybe. I'm probably never going to buy one, I can't afford one. We went to Italy a few years ago, and my husband thought, you know what, maybe we should pop into the shop and have a look. Fortunately for us, the shop was shut. And instead, he came back with this, which was a £30 espresso deal. I have used this before. I never liked them because the coffee that you make, I always want it too dark. But this one is special. It's got a little, I actually don't know how it works. In all my education in physics, I've never figured out this thing. It's got a little bubbly thing in the middle, which gives it more foam and froth. So any of the physicists in the room want to explain that to me? Yes, please. So we ended up with this guy somehow 2 years ago. It is now in a box. We're no longer using it. Now, the question is why, yeah? I'll show you what we are using. This thing. It's yay big. It's this small, and it fits in our bag when we go traveling. It takes the Nespresso capsules as well as you can have a little grinder thing. You can put your own coffee in there if you really want. It's super nutty. And now the debate in the household is we're considering one of these, because now I've taken a strong stance against Nespresso because I find it very wasteful. I didn't want to throw away more plastic than I need to. But now you can actually get little capsule things that are usable, so you can put your own coffee in it. What's the job? Too many. So when we think about jobs to be done, these are the kinds of things we tend to come up with in the, sort of the first and foremost, in the first blush. Doughs, whey beans, grind the coffee. You've heard me talk about the different grinders. Tamping the coffee. This is specifically for espresso, right? Obviously, if you're making a French press, it's different. Sorry, technical. You make a brew, you make an extract, or maybe you might froth the milk if you want a cappuccino. But these are tasks. And one of the hardest things, and when I work with people trying to learn about jobs to be done, one of the first things we end up with is a list of tasks. And the challenge then is to figure out, how do you think in terms of jobs? A job is really an outcome, it's a desired goal. So let me give you an example with just these little steps. So if you're dosing? It's a little strange word, weighing beans. What you really are trying to do is you're trying to ensure that there's a right concentration of coffee to water. It's an important thing. And if you are trying to grind coffee, you're really trying to obtain the right granularity for the right brew, for the character of the beans. And yes, technically, if you want to do it right, every bag of beans you get, you're supposed to adjust the grinder. Anyhow, I don't do that. And if you're tamping coffee, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to create a consistent surface for an even extraction. This is sounding like a science lesson. Sorry. And if you're making a brew or an extract, you are trying to extract the maximum flavor, and you are making the right coffee to the right person's taste, possibly if you're using an AeroPress. The top is the task, the bottom is the job. Can you see the difference? Yeah? It's not that far off, but it really does take a little twist in perception, or perception to see what a job is alongside the tasks. So these are kind of fairly low-level jobs. They're roughly about the same level. There are other jobs, just based on that little long story I've told you about coffee. It has to fit on the kitchen counter. It's a requirement. There's also a notion of being aesthetically pleasing, or for me anyway, create minimum waste. So you've got these levels of jobs that are kind of normal when you start thinking about things in this way. But usually you should have like a core job, which is like, if you want to think about the sole reason to be, sole raison d'être, make a perfect espresso every time. And this is the job that we struggle with in my household, because we haven't found one that would make a perfect espresso every time, which is why we've gone through so much kit. So that's in essence the idea of a job. And I'm going to now talk about jobs theory really quickly, because once you get what a job is, it's fairly easy. And the hard part is really about the applications, which I'll go into, and sort of give you maybe a way to navigate the landscape. So on jobs theory, if you've read anything about jobs to be done, these names will be familiar to you. Clay Christensen, who's written a number of books, including Competing Against Luck. Tony Ulwick, who is famous for his outcome-driven innovation framework. And the guys, Bob and Chris, who ran the Jobs to be Done interview. And also Alan, who talks about, his book actually is probably the most well-known, and his article on job stories is probably the most well-known. I'll talk about each of these in little bits later on, but key things you need to know about jobs theory. A job is stable over time and doesn't change. In theory, I think it has longevity. Maybe it will change slightly or have nuances, but if you write a job, I'm thinking like making an espresso is probably a job that has been around for a little while. I don't know how long, but it has been around for a little while and it's not likely to change. And other things about the theory, this one is particularly important. You hire or fire something to do a job. And you can see that, what you give up and what you take on to try and do this thing over and over again in the best way possible. This is jobs theory, all sentences. A job should eventually map to universal need. Now, we are working in UX and product, for example. Although if you really map it to universal need, it probably is too high level for you to do anything with it from a design perspective. So just so that you know, some people like to use the Maslow's hierarchy. I don't, because actually it's been disproved, and it's also based on a very, very narrow sample set of Western European people. Whereas if you want to use a framework to help you sort of back up your claims or back up your stories about jobs, Schwartz's is pretty good. It's a, I want to say, surveys of 25,000 in 44 countries. And so, there are sort of these values which everything holds and hangs off on. So make the perfect espresso every time. I say that's hedonism. and probably for me also a sense of achievement every time. So let's go into the applications, and I'm just triple checking that we have got enough time. Excellent. Because this is where the meat is. Okay, so these are the fellows who have, so there are many applications of jobs to be done, and I think where it gets confusing if you start reading about it is people have different opinions about how to apply it. It doesn't mean that any one of them is more right than the other. It's almost where to understand which framework works best in what circumstance, and that's the trick. So, but these are the main, most of the articles published out there are probably either by Tony. I don't think Bob and Chris publish so much anymore, and you will find stuff by Alan, and there are 3 or 4 other authors out there who write a lot about jobs to be done. They are corresponding books to go with their philosophies, so I'm going to start talking with Ulrich first, because that's nice and meaty. Ulrich's framework has been around for at least 10 years. It's called outcome-driven innovation, but now he's kind of rebranded to talk about jobs to be done because that's where, it's an application of a theory. In order to understand that, you can try and read his book, but I would almost recommend going back to 2002 to an article he wrote for the Harvard Business Review. It's a lot easier to understand, especially in terms of methodology. I'll do a comparison, mostly because I'm a bit of a nerd about such things. So on the right is the content of the book, is the many different steps he goes through to apply the framework. And on the right is the stuff from the article, and you can see why I say read the article, it's a lot shorter, it goes to the point. And then maybe if you want to sort of flesh out your knowledge of what he does, the book is pretty good. But in a nutshell, let me give you the trailer version of the movie. This looks like a pretty solid research methodology, doesn't it? A little bit of qual, a little bit of quant, and then a way to make sense of it. So let me tell you what it is, and maybe, to the best of my knowledge, I have to say that it's been quite difficult to find out how the interviews are conducted. Some of you might have noticed a thread between Jared Spool and Ulrich on Twitter recently about this particular topic. The interviews, they're not so different from how you and I might do task analysis. We capture steps and procedures. The only difference is we might find different ways of using that data afterwards. The way ODI works is you frame the insights as outcome statements. I've since found out that there are also multiple ways that you might use this. So this is only one version of how ODI may work. There are other ways. Then you from your interviews, just gather as many as possible of these outcome statements. I'll show you what they look like in a minute if you haven't seen them before. You organize them, you duplicate them, you categorize them, and then you stick them out to a survey with a wider audience. So obviously you have to know what the audience is for whatever you're working on to do that. So like I said, it was a little bit difficult to figure out what they ask. So usually you try to look in the interviews, you're trying to look for what people are trying to accomplish, what steps they take. Again, not so different from what you and I would normally do in a task analysis or trying to establish a user journey. But we're also mostly looking for the outcomes. So these are not questions that you might ask in an interview, but these are sort of like little pointers of where you might direct your questions. What makes getting this job done in this situation time-consuming, inefficient, unpredictable, inconvenient, or difficult? Or you might try and capture emotional jobs. How do you feel? How do you want people around you to feel? Or social jobs. I'm going to show you 2 little things from the framework which I found useful, and they are things that are sort of like good summaries, if you like. They're good formal manifestations of a user need. A job statement, something like this. Listen to music while on the go. Make a perfect espresso every time. Oh, there you go. I have the slide. That is an example of a job statement. Really, really simple. Starts with a verb. And look for what people are trying to achieve. The craft is to make sure that it talks about the actual goal rather than the task. Yeah. Outcome statements on the surface look a little tricky, but they're essentially, the way I like to talk about them is they're a statement that helps you articulate how you might measure change, and specifically desired change. So Minimize the likelihood that the music sounds distorted when played at high volume. Something like this. Minimize the time it takes for me to make a perfect coffee. I want my one-button grinder. So the tricky part then is once you've got all these outcome statements, you're supposed to put it to a survey, the same type of audience, but many more people, in order to justify what you get them to do is something quite like, let me show you, I don't know if that comes through okay, because it's a bit of a fuzzy image. So you have got a list of outcome statements, you ask your users to rank how important it is to them, and how satisfied are they currently with this job statement. Now, the problem is anyone I've spoken to, and certainly we've tried it, this is actually a very difficult survey to make usable. So from our sort of usability hats, this is actually quite difficult because at one point you think, how valid is data if someone's going to get bored of filling out 200 things looking like the same thing? So there are challenges in this particular survey. We have found ways around it. We have used things like, we just get people to select the ones that are relevant to them, and so that the list is a lot shorter, and there are many other tricks. Feel free to ask me about more detail about the survey if you want later on. Anyway, so once you've got the difference between once you have an idea of how important it is for your audience versus how satisfied they are or unsatisfied, you have an opportunity algorithm, which is just a formula to calculate what jobs are being underserved, what outcomes are being underserved. So you can imagine if something that's really important but not very satisfied, there's an opportunity there to do something to fix it. So you see, that's how that works. There's something else about OX framework that's great, which is the universal job map. Nobody I know have actually, so this is supposed to be universal where you've got all the steps, but nobody I know have done this in exactly that way. So if you think about the coffee making, each of these essentially are separate categories of steps, and they may have small things. And you might say, if I am one of those little Nespresso capsules, I'm actually doing the first three jobs, right? I'm doing the right concentration of coffee, I'm doing the right granularity and a consistent surface. So you can decide when you are doing a product, if you want to address the one job or multiple jobs, and also based on who the competition is. Maybe a slightly more serious type example, banking. Manage my daily expenses from paycheck, manage my money in different currencies if I'm traveling, and help me save intelligently from day-to-day spending, so you can see that these could be different apps, or it could be the one bank. The switch interview. Zipping through it really quickly. The switch interview is a very particular type of interview, and it's been an interesting challenge for me to teach other researchers how to do it, because we often run our interviews in themes, whereas the switch interview, the key is to let the user story rise. There are challenges with it. You have to speak to people who have switched to you and switched away, and in that context, you can establish the jobs to be done. So there is, that book actually has this script in it, so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just to show you briefly. So you've got the usual stuff, like no wrong answers, it's a casual conversation, but there is a trick there where the particular interview is designed to surface memory, so they ask for a lot of crazy details, and the idea is to establish a timeline of decision-making on how they come to purchase something. So you're trying to establish what are types of triggers or events that would bring people in, or circumstances that bring them into actively looking for something versus just passively browsing and thinking, oh, maybe I need a new coffee maker. There's a bit of a challenge to adapt it. People find it tricky because the question seems very specific. What day is it? Is it Saturday? So there are examples of the interviews online. I would normally pay one, but we haven't got enough time today to do that. So there are examples of the audio interviews online at jtbd.info, I think, or just come ping me later and I'll send out the link to where these live. The challenge is you don't need to take the questions literally, because what you're really trying to do is to surface the story. So use a narrative framework. I find this easier to think about than a set of questions. If they talk about a person, I ask them about the person. If they talk about a place, I ask them about a place. So that way you allow the story to rise, and you spend your time listening to what they have to say in terms of how things change. Or you can use something like a Karpman's drama triangle, a model which helps you determine if they're playing victim, who's the savior. I don't know if my coffee maker is going to save me, but Anyhow, there are other ways to think about the interview. So you don't have to ask somebody, when's the first time you thought about buying a coffee maker? It could be, when's the first time you encounter a Bodum French press? How well do you know the product? How loyal are you in that case? When's the first time you were aware of its existence? The challenge with something like this is very different from how we normally do interviews, and certainly really far away from how we would do a usability test. Because a story can begin at any point, so having that timeline to help you track is very massively useful. These interviews are quite difficult to follow and quite difficult to analyze, but you're going to get so much out of it in a short amount of time, and you often get motivations and pretty emotional stuff coming up. With these type of interviews, good question designs still matter, but what I really like is this particular analysis tool. It's based on the Lewis change model. So the idea is, once you've done your interviews, you look at what kinds of triggers occur in people's lives to make them make that decision. What kinds of factors make them choose one thing over another? And you also look at what things stop them from changing, and what are the issues that cause them anxiety. So for me, it could be things like, does it cost £3,000? That would give me a heart attack. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. Because of the nature of switch, it works best when somebody has a choice and decision. So you need to speak to someone who, so for example, in a B2B situation, just to riff off on that, you would need to speak to people who actually brought the product as well as people who are using it. Because they're the ones who are using it may not be the people who chose to use a product, for example, in a B2B situation. So choice is a thing that you need to consider. So Alan Clement this particular article way back is based on an article, I want to say, Paul Adams is the VP of Design at Intercom, and I think it's through their work together that this became formalized as a job story. So I know, I'm guessing just virtually that having worked with many people in this field, job stories are probably your intro into jobs to be done. They're fairly similar to what we write as user needs, especially in the UK. And they are useful in different contexts. So they're much more suitable for design because they're at that contextual level. So something like this: when rushing to get out of the door in the morning, I want a fail-safe way to make coffee so that I can be energized on the way to work. So it's more contextual. It helps us visualize what the circumstance it is that we're designing for. Here's another one. When I'm making coffee for the family after a weekend meal, I want to be able to cater for a range of preferences without hassle. So maybe the AeroPress. So that I can get back to conversation with everyone rather than being stuck in the kitchen making coffee for the whole family, one espresso at a time. Okay. Quick one, last little bits. Alan is working on something really interesting because he is trying to extend the framework, and his philosophy is, so you have like a task-based view of looking at jobs, but you also have that idea of progress, the idea that you want to be a better version of yourself. He's developing a new system for coding different types of interviews that he's doing. So he looks for desired future states, for catalysts or triggers. Those 4 bullet points are very, very similar to the 4 forces that I showed you before in the diagram. And looking at constraints and whether the solution's available and what solutions are available now. So in that way, it helps you sort of map all these forces together. In terms of the toolbox, and this is an interesting little thing, so we've got data gathering, analysis, synthesis modeling, and prioritization tools available to you from jobs to be done. I really briefly talked through these. There's more, I just couldn't fit them on here. In terms of when you would use it, jobs to be done is much more at home in the problem space than in the solution space. And in the UX stack, for example, it's much stronger on the needs side, but with a little bit of skill, you can get quite, articulate design needs and parameters from there. Just a few things you need to know about applying it. Again, feel free to talk to me afterwards. It's a huge thing. It usually takes me a day to code jobs to be done. 20 minutes is too short. Are you an app? Well, not you literally, but no. If you're an app or a SaaS, your core job should be obvious, because if you don't have a core job, you probably shouldn't be an app. In which case, jobs to be done is very useful for bringing up the secondary stuff and the contextual information. if you cannot identify a hiring or firing point, jobs to be done is probably not the framework that you can use. So it's very, very specific. If you can't identify what somebody's giving up in firing, then this is probably the wrong framework for what you're trying to learn. I've already talked about choice and decision. If you can't choose the switch, for example, the switch interview doesn't work very well if there's no choice. It's a bit of a challenge. It can be adapted, but I found it to be difficult. And there's also a question of scope and time. People who write about jobs to be done will have you believe that you can solve everything with it. Challenge the chances if your problem space is too wide. If it's an unknown problem, cloud problem, complex problem, you're probably far better off using our methods like ethnography and other discovery methods to help you. So, jobs to be done is really about a question of needs. Everything you ever need: tobacco, water, beer, and stamp. So, in short, I think I want to say that the best part about jobs to be done is how you can use it to articulate needs consistently across the board from discovery to design. And that will be me. Thank you very much.